The royal portraits still hang in Madrid today, their painted eyes staring back across centuries. At first glance, they look like the proud faces of kings and queens who once ruled half the known world. But look closer, and you'll see something else, the same jawline repeated again and again, the same heavy lips, the same tired eyes that seem to grow weaker with each generation. By the final portrait, the face is almost grotesque, no longer a symbol of power, but of decay. That face belonged to Carlos II of Spain, remembered by history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched King. His story is not a fairy tale, but a tragedy written in blood. For centuries, the Habsburg dynasty believed their rule was blessed, that their royal blood was too sacred to be mixed with outsiders. Cousin married cousin, uncle married niece, generation after generation, until their family tree twisted into something more like a noose. By the time Carlos was born in 1661, Spain was already fading. The once mighty empire bled from endless wars, bankrupt treasuries, and rebellions it could no longer suppress. But the true disaster was not outside its borders, it was inside the palace nursery. The infant prince was weak, sickly, and silent. He was meant to save a kingdom. Instead, he would become the last thread in a tapestry that was unraveling. This is the story of a dynasty that defied nature, and of a boy who carried the weight of an empire in a body too frail to survive it. The year was 1651, and Spain's golden empire was already showing cracks. In Madrid, the Alcazar palace stood like a fortress of stone and ceremony, its walls echoing with the footsteps of courtiers, its windows opening onto a city that glittered with pride but whispered of decline. Inside those halls, King Philip IV walked slowly, his robes heavy, his expression heavier still. For decades, Spain had seemed invincible. Silver poured in from the mines of the Americas. Spanish galleons ruled the seas. The Habsburg banner flew over land stretching from Naples to the Low Countries, from Mexico to the Philippines. It was a realm where the sun famously never set. But empires, like men, wear down. Philip could see it happening in real time. Portugal, once bound tightly under Spanish rule, had broken away 10 years earlier. Catalonia, restless and rebellious, fought to shake free. France, the eternal rival, was gaining strength, pushing at the borders with a relentlessness that Spain no longer had the energy to match. The treasury was nearly empty, drained by wars that never seemed to end. Soldiers went unpaid, battles went poorly, and the whispers grew louder. Spain was no longer what it once was. Philip felt the weight of these truths each day. His courtiers still called him Lord of Spain and the Indies, but he knew the title had grown hollow. When his chamberlain entered to announce an audience request, Philip waved him away. He didn't want to see anyone. What could be said that he had not already heard? What remedy could there be for an empire bleeding from every corner? And yet, there was something deeper troubling the king, something he saw not in maps or treasury reports, but in mirrors and portraits. In the great Venetian mirror of the Alcazar, the king stared at his own reflection, a long, narrow face, the heavy Habsburg jaw, the drooping lower lip that seemed to pull his expression into a permanent sadness. These were not just his features, they were his family's curse. The Habsburgs had ruled half of Europe not by winning battles but by arranging marriages. Their family motto had declared it openly, "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." And marry they did, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, over and over, until their bloodlines folded back on themselves. Philip did not understand the science of genetics, but he saw the results in the faces of his ancestors staring down from the palace galleries. The same features repeating, growing more exaggerated, more grotesque with every generation. He remembered his father's dying words, still burning in his memory, "God, who gave me so many kingdoms, has denied me a son strong enough to rule them." It had been true for his father, and now, with the death of his heir Prince Balthazar Carlos, it was true for him. The thought haunted him like a shadow that never left his side. Spain could survive wars. It could survive bankruptcy. But could it survive without a strong heir? Philip turned his eyes to another portrait, the painting of Mariana of Austria, his young bride. She had been only 14 when he married her, he was 44. To commoners it would have seemed scandalous, but among royals it was expected. She was his niece as well as his wife, her blood tied to his through both his sister and his cousin, Emperor Ferdinand III. Their union was as close as it could be, and Philip prayed it would give him what he needed most, a son. Mariana had already borne him a daughter, little Margarita Teresa, and now she was pregnant again. Philip prayed with fervor that this child would be a boy. Yet as he gazed at her painted likeness, he could not stop his mind from drifting to Isabella of Bourbon, his first wife, a French princess who had died 7 years earlier. Isabella had been his companion, his partner in more ways than one. Their blood connection had been distant by Habsburg standards, merely second cousins. And perhaps because of that, she had given him healthier children. But most of them had not lived long, and now only their daughter Maria Theresa remained. Spain's strength seemed to die with his heirs. Still, Philip clung to other passions, perhaps to distract himself. He found solace in art, in the brushstrokes of Velázquez, in the plays of Calderón de la Barca, in the brilliance of Spanish theater. While the empire crumbled, the arts soared under his patronage. This was Spain's golden age of culture, even as its power in Europe dimmed. The contrast was striking, masterpieces on canvas, empty coffers in the treasury. Great dramas on stage, disastrous reports from the battlefronts. The dispatches came daily, news from Naples, from Flanders, from distant provinces once thought secure. Each carried the same burden: defeat, rebellion, exhaustion. Advisors urged Philip to make peace, to acknowledge Portugal's independence, to surrender territory. But such admissions felt like a betrayal of everything his ancestors had built. He rubbed his temples as the headaches came, knowing full well what he could not say aloud: Spain was already slipping away. That evening, when he visited Mariana, he found her praying, rosary beads sliding through her fingers. She rose slowly, her pregnant belly heavy, her youth already giving way to the solemn gravity expected of a Habsburg queen. When he placed his hand on her belly, he felt the restless kicks of the child within. "It will be a boy," he declared with sudden conviction. "God will not abandon Spain in these troubled times." Mariana smiled, but her eyes betrayed fear. She had already suffered miscarriages. Infant deaths were common even among royals, but in the Habsburg family it felt almost like a curse. She tried to change the subject, reminding him of her father's greetings from Vienna. But Philip's thoughts returned always to the same prayer: a son, a strong son, to save the monarchy. Outside the palace windows, the sunset bathed Madrid in golden light, painting the illusion of prosperity. But Philip knew it was only an illusion. Banquets and hunts could disguise the decline, but they could not reverse it. And so he prayed again: "O God, grant me a son." History would grant his prayer. But the price would be far more terrible than he could ever have imagined. The shadow of the Habsburg name loomed over Philip IV like an inescapable fate. When he looked into the mirror, he didn't only see himself, he saw the generations that had come before him, and the twisted path that had led his family to this point. For centuries, the Habsburg dynasty had played the game of power not through conquests but through marriages. Their motto had said it all: "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." And marry they did, weaving alliances across Europe without ever stepping far outside their own bloodline. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, contracts written in flesh and sealed at the altar. It worked, for a time. The Habsburgs came to rule Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and influence even stretched into the Holy Roman Empire. But nature had no care for political necessity. What seemed like clever dynastic strategy was, in truth, the building of a fragile human trap. With each generation, the blood grew thinner, the family tree tangled tighter, until the faces on the palace walls told a silent story of decay. The Habsburg jaw became their most infamous trademark: an elongated chin, a drooping lip, a feature that might once have been dismissed as a quirk but now revealed itself as a genetic brand. In Philip's time, the portraits of his ancestors were almost like a gallery of warnings. Their eyes seemed to follow him through the halls, their lips sagging with the same hereditary curse. And yet, the dynasty pressed on. They had convinced themselves that the rules of nature did not apply to them. If they kept their blood pure, they believed, their power would remain unshakable. The church blessed these marriages, declaring them sanctified unions, ignoring the whispers of deformities, stillbirths, and frail heirs. Gold from Spain's colonies could purchase papal approval as easily as soldiers. Philip knew the price all too well. His first wife, Isabella of Bourbon, had been a French princess. Their marriage had been politically strategic, yet by Habsburg standards, the blood connection was relatively distant, only second cousins. With Isabella, Philip had experienced something unusual in the cold politics of royal unions, companionship. She had shared his burdens, softened his temper, and given him children. But almost all of them died young. Only Maria Theresa survived, a daughter destined to be married off like all Habsburg daughters, a pawn in yet another dynastic game. Isabella herself died young, leaving Philip to grieve as both king and man. When he married Mariana of Austria, he bound himself even more tightly into the family web. She was the daughter of his sister and his cousin. By blood, Mariana was his niece as well as his wife. To outsiders, such a union might have seemed grotesque. To the Habsburgs, it was routine. The king told himself this was God's will, that through Mariana the dynasty would find its salvation. She was young, devout, and already bore the solemnity of her line. At 14 she had been led from the Viennese court to Madrid, a child stepping into the role of queen. At 17, she carried within her the hopes of the entire Spanish Empire. Philip's prayers were constant. He sought solace in the chapel, kneeling before gilded altars, begging not for victory in war but for something far more personal, a son. He lit candles, whispered vows, promised devotion. He believed a male heir would be Spain's redemption, the answer to the empire's decline. But in his quieter moments, when the corridors of the Alcazar were empty and the only sound was the echo of his footsteps, Philip admitted to himself what he dared not say aloud: the dynasty was cursed, not by witchcraft, but by its own arrogance. The evidence surrounded him. His father had died lamenting that God had denied him a strong son. His own son, Balthazar Carlos, the bright hope of Spain, had been taken before reaching manhood. And now, all hopes rested on Mariana's unborn child. The irony was cruel. The very marriages meant to secure the throne had instead undermined it. Spain's enemies might have been France, Portugal, or rebellious provinces, but its most dangerous enemy was its own blood. Meanwhile, outside the palace, life in Spain continued with all its contradictions. The theaters thrived under Calderón de la Barca, dazzling audiences with plays that explored honor, faith, and destiny. Diego Velázquez painted masterpieces, capturing both the grandeur and the fragility of the court. The arts flourished even as the empire's foundations rotted. It was as if Spain itself tried to cover its wounds with beauty, hoping no one would notice the blood seeping beneath the golden paint. But people did notice. The treasury was empty. Merchants grumbled at heavy taxes. Soldiers deserted when pay never came. The empire that once ruled seas and continents was now a giant staggering under its own weight. And in the heart of it all was a king haunted by the past and fearful of the future. When Philip placed his hand on Mariana's belly, he felt the tiny kicks of life inside her. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe. It will be a boy, he told her, as if saying it with enough conviction might bend fate itself. Mariana smiled faintly, but she too carried the fear of every Habsburg mother. Would this child live, and if so, what kind of life would it have? The candles burned low that night in the Alcazar. Outside, Madrid glittered with the illusion of power, but inside the palace, a more fragile truth stirred. A dynasty was waiting for a savior, but the savior they longed for would arrive in a form no one could have predicted. For Mariana would indeed give birth to a boy, a frail child who would one day inherit the crown, but not the strength to bear it. His name would be Carlos, and history would remember him not as Spain's salvation, but as its warning. The long-awaited cry of a newborn echoed through the halls of the Alcazar in the autumn of 1661. Madrid erupted in celebration. At last, King Philip IV and Queen Mariana of Austria had a son. Church bells rang across the capital, fireworks lit up the night sky, and bullfights entertained crowds who cheered as if Spain's future had been secured in an instant. The boy was baptized Carlos, and for a brief moment the weight of dynastic anxiety seemed lifted. But behind the walls of the palace nursery, reality quickly soured. The infant prince was frail, unable to feed properly, his cry weak and intermittent. Royal physicians reassured the king that the boy was merely delicate, that with careful attention he would thrive. Philip, now in his mid-50s and burdened by decades of failure and loss, wanted desperately to believe them. Yet in his heart he knew the truth: this child was not like other infants he had known. Carlos's body seemed to betray him from the very beginning. His movements were sluggish, his eyes dim and unfocused. Mariana, still so young herself, poured every ounce of energy into his care. She allowed only trusted attendants near his chamber, convinced that illness or witchcraft lurked at every door. Spain was a land steeped in superstition, and every unexplained sickness was whispered to be the work of curses. But Mariana insisted, the blood of the Habsburgs runs through his veins. He will grow stronger in time. Time, however, told a different story. At 2 years old, Carlos could barely stand. At 4, he still struggled to form words, his protruding jaw making it difficult even to eat. Behind closed doors, courtiers exchanged anxious glances and cruel whispers, but never in the presence of king or queen. To acknowledge the truth, that the heir to Europe's most powerful throne was deformed in both body and mind, was unthinkable. By 1665, the situation grew darker still. Philip IV, worn down by years of war and despair, fell gravely ill. The once proud king, who had prayed so desperately for an heir, now found himself on his deathbed, confronted with the terrible reality of the son who would succeed him. Summoning Queen Mariana to his side, he spoke with rare clarity, "I fear for the future, Mariana. Our son is not well." She tried to reassure him, fighting back tears. "He will improve, Felipe. With God's help, he will grow stronger." But Philip shook his head weakly. "It is not God's will that has harmed him. It is our blood. We have married within our own family for too long." Mariana gasped, horrified at his words. To her, the family unions had always been sanctified by the Church. But Philip knew better. The Church blesses what we ask it to bless, especially when it comes with gifts. But not even the Pope can change the laws of nature. On September 17, 1665, Philip IV breathed his last. The crown of Spain passed to his son, a fragile child of 4 years old. The kingdom now rested in the hands of Carlos II, the boy who would one day be called El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The regency fell to Queen Mariana, supported by a council of grandees and clerics. But in truth, the entire monarchy revolved around the sickly boy. His mother shielded him obsessively, forbidding harsh words in his presence, keeping him in an atmosphere of suffocating protection. His education was neglected, partly because of his limitations, partly because no one believed he would live long enough to rule. At 6, he could not feed himself or maintain basic hygiene. His jaw protruded so far that he could not close his mouth completely, leaving him constantly drooling. His legs were so weak he could barely walk without help. Foreign ambassadors reported home with brutal honesty. Pierre de Layer, envoy of France, wrote to Louis XIV, "He is too weak to hold a conversation. His face is pale and drawn, his expression vacant. He can scarcely walk and tires at once. I do not believe he can live long." But against every prediction, Carlos survived. Year after year, he clung to life, defying those who thought him doomed. The regency stretched on until 1675, when Carlos turned 14 and was formally declared of age. But everyone knew it was only a formality. The boy who now wore the crown of Spain could barely govern himself, much less an empire. For Spain, it was a cruel paradox. The empire's survival had once depended on producing an heir. Now it had one, yet that heir embodied all the weaknesses of the dynasty. The blood that had once united kingdoms had now betrayed them, leaving Spain with a monarch in name only. As courtiers schemed and foreign powers watched hungrily, Carlos remained a passive figure, a fragile boy surrounded by shadows. His reign had begun, but in truth, the tragedy of his life was already written. The Alcazar Palace had always been the beating heart of Madrid, but after 1665 it became something different, a fortress of silence, a prison of whispers. Within its walls lived the new king of Spain, Carlos II, 4 years old, frail, and utterly unprepared for the burden that history had placed upon him. His mother, Queen Mariana, ruled as regent, her figure draped in solemn black veils and heavy gowns that made her look older than her years. She was only 21 when she assumed the weight of an empire, yet her face carried the shadows of exhaustion and fear. All her hopes, all her prayers, revolved around the small, fragile boy who sat awkwardly on the throne. Carlos's world was suffocating. His chamber was guarded constantly, not against assassins but against drafts of cold air, evil eyes, or anyone suspected of carrying illness. Mariana allowed only carefully chosen attendants near him. She dismissed nurses who made the slightest comment about his weakness, convinced that negativity itself could curse the child. In a kingdom saturated with superstition, her vigilance fed rumors: if the boy survived, it would be by miracle alone. But survival did not mean health. By the age of 6, Carlos still could not dress himself or hold a spoon. His tutors reported that he could barely read or write, though some whispered that the lessons were never serious. Why bother teaching a child who might not live another year? He shuffled through corridors, drooling constantly because he could not fully close his jaw. Courtiers bowed to him, but their eyes betrayed what their lips never dared speak: this was not a king. Spain itself reflected its monarch, outwardly grand, inwardly failing. The empire's map still stretched across oceans, but rebellion simmered in Catalonia, Portugal stood defiantly independent, and France pressed relentlessly at the borders. The once glorious Spanish Armada rotted in harbor, its sailors unpaid, its sails tattered. The treasury, drained by war and extravagance, limped from one bankruptcy to another. And yet, within the palace, life moved as if nothing had changed. Banquets dazzled. Plays entertained. Courtiers plotted. The Regency Council fractured almost immediately. Mariana leaned heavily on her Austrian allies, seeking support from Vienna, her homeland. Powerful Spanish nobles, resentful of foreign influence, pushed back. Priests whispered counsel in her ear, while grandees schemed behind closed doors. Everyone knew that control of the kingdom lay not with Carlos, who was too weak to control anything, but with whoever could dominate his mother and her court. It was a bitter irony: Spain had once been held together by its kings. Now it was held hostage by a child who barely understood the crown he wore. Foreign ambassadors sent home reports that read less like political dispatches and more like medical updates. Letters to Louis XIV described Carlos's vacant expression, his sluggish movements, his inability to converse. Envoys wrote bluntly that the King of Spain might not live to see manhood. And yet, year after year, the boy survived. His survival was almost uncanny. Whenever illness struck, and it often did, priests were summoned to perform exorcisms at his bedside. Candles were lit, prayers recited, relics pressed against his body. Physicians experimented with potions of herbs and animal parts, desperate to strengthen his frail constitution. Each time he pulled through, his survival was hailed as divine. But to many, it seemed less a blessing than a cruel prolonging of suffering, for the boy himself, and for the empire chained to him. By the time he reached 12, Carlos had grown taller but not stronger. His legs trembled when he walked, and he tired after only a few steps. His tutors noted his limited understanding, his tendency to sit silently, staring into space. Yet, in official ceremonies, the court presented him as a symbol of stability. He was dressed in elaborate brocades, placed on a throne, and guided through the rituals of kingship like a puppet in an elaborate play. The people of Madrid caught only glimpses of their monarch, a pale figure carried through the streets during processions, his body fragile, his head too large for his frame. Some whispered he was cursed. Others pitied him as an innocent boy trapped in a cruel destiny. But none could deny the unease his presence inspired. The court, meanwhile, hardened into factions. Mariana's Austrian connections kept her tied to the Holy Roman Emperor, while many Spanish nobles rallied around other claimants, hoping to secure influence in the inevitable collapse. The empire that once dictated the fate of Europe was now being dissected in advance, its future decided in whispers long before the boy king reached adulthood. Through it all, Carlos himself remained almost absent from his own reign. He played with toys well past the age when other princes trained in arms. He clung to his mother, who both protected and smothered him. He spent hours staring at the portraits of his ancestors, as if wondering whether he too would soon hang as another face in the gallery of decline. In 1675, when Carlos turned 14, the regency officially ended. A great ceremony declared him of age. Trumpets blared, courtiers bowed, and proclamations announced Spain's young king stepping into his rightful authority. But behind the pageantry, everyone knew it was a fiction. Carlos could barely sign his name, let alone govern a sprawling empire. What Spain received that day was not a monarch but a symbol, a fragile boy dressed as a king, his body racked with the weight of centuries of inbreeding, his mind clouded by frailty. The empire continued to crumble, not with a thunderous collapse, but with a slow, agonizing decay, mirroring the life of the boy who wore its crown. And so, in the palaces of Madrid, Spain's destiny balanced precariously on the shoulders of a child who could not carry it. His reign had only just begun, but already the seeds of tragedy had been sown. By the time Carlos II reached 18, Spain had endured 14 years of uncertainty under his fragile reign. He was king in name, but not in substance. Too weak to govern, too simple-minded to navigate politics, he drifted through ceremonies like a shadow in gilded robes. The court, weary of waiting, turned to the one solution that seemed left, marriage. Perhaps, they reasoned, a wife could bring stability. Perhaps she could guide the king, give him strength, and most importantly, provide the one thing Spain desperately needed, an heir. The chosen bride was Marie-Louise d'Orléans, the niece of France's powerful monarch, Louis XIV. The match was bold and politically risky. France was Spain's eternal rival, but Louis saw an opportunity to extend his influence, and Mariana of Austria, still dominant in her son's court, reluctantly accepted. When Marie-Louise arrived in Madrid in 1679, she was 17, bright-eyed, graceful, and filled with cautious hope. She had been raised at the glittering court of Versailles, surrounded by elegance and ambition. Her tutors had prepared her for duty, for the possibility of marrying into another royal house. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her husband. The moment she met Carlos, the weight of her fate sank in. Before her stood a young man of 18, but he did not look like a king. His head was abnormally large compared to his frail body. His Habsburg jaw jutted forward grotesquely, making it difficult for him to chew or speak clearly. Saliva gathered constantly at the corners of his mouth. His eyes, often vacant, wandered without focus. He walked with effort, his legs trembling under the weight of his robes. Marie-Louise, daughter of France, felt her heart fall. She had been told she was marrying a king. Instead, she found herself bound to a man who seemed more like an invalid than a monarch. Yet she could not refuse. Duty was duty, and a crown, even a broken one, could not be declined. The marriage was celebrated with pomp, parades, and banquets. Outside the palace, the people cheered. Inside, Marie-Louise quietly began the most miserable chapter of her life. Carlos adored her in his way, clinging to her presence, but he was incapable of fulfilling the role of husband. The union was never consummated. Physicians and priests suggested remedies, ranging from herbal potions to bizarre rituals involving sacred relics. Nothing changed. The queen remained childless, and whispers began to spread, perhaps she was to blame. The truth was cruelly obvious to those closest to the royal bedchamber. Carlos was physically incapable of fathering children. His body, warped by centuries of inbreeding, had left him sterile. But in a court ruled by superstition and intrigue, blame rarely followed truth. Rivals began accusing Marie-Louise of negligence, of refusing her duties as queen. Some even whispered she was cursed or that French enemies had bewitched her. The young queen endured in silence. Letters to her family reveal her despair. She confessed her loneliness, her isolation in a foreign land, and her inability to find happiness beside her husband. Versailles seemed like a dream she had lost forever. Yet despite her suffering, Marie-Louise tried to fulfill her public role. She attended ceremonies, smiled when needed, and played the part of a dutiful queen. But behind the painted fans and embroidered gowns, her spirit withered. After a decade of this quiet misery, tragedy struck. In 1689, at just 26 years old, Marie-Louise died suddenly. Officially, her death was blamed on an accident while riding a horse. She had eaten too many sweets, some claimed, and fell ill. But the court was awash with rumors. Some whispered she had been poisoned by rivals who saw her as an obstacle. Others insisted her body had simply given way under years of stress and despair. Carlos was devastated. For days he wandered the palace in grief, refusing food, weeping openly. He had depended on her presence, her patience, perhaps even her pity. Now she was gone, and Spain was once again without an heir. The court wasted no time. A widowed king could not remain unmarried. Within a year, a second bride was chosen, Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess from the Palatinate. Unlike Marie-Louise, Mariana was ambitious and politically astute. From the moment she entered Madrid, she set out to dominate the court. She brought with her an army of German attendants, filling positions of influence with her allies. Her presence ignited fresh resentment among Spanish nobles, who saw her as yet another foreign force steering their kingdom. The palace became a battlefield of factions, Austrians, Germans, and Spaniards, all scheming for control over the powerless king. But Mariana's ambitions could not overcome biology. Carlos remained sterile. Doctors prescribed increasingly desperate remedies, concoctions made from bull's testicles, potions blessed by priests, even rituals involving bathing in animal blood. Exorcists were summoned to drive out supposed demons. At one point, officials dug up corpses, searching for evidence of sorcery. Still, no child came. As the years dragged on, Carlos himself began to believe he was cursed. He confided in his confessor that some dark spell prevented him from fathering children. He endured exorcisms at his bedside, his body trembling under the weight of chants and relics. The court, gripped by fear and superstition, leaned deeper into witch hunts, burning suspected sorcerers in hopes of lifting the curse from the king. But the curse was not witchcraft. It was blood. Generations of Habsburg marriages had led to this moment, a king broken from birth, trapped in a body too frail to rule, too damaged to reproduce. Spain had pinned its future on his ability to father a child, and now that future was slipping away. As Carlos grew older, the tragedy only deepened. By 30, his hair thinned, his skin sagged, and his body shook with seizures. He looked twice his age, a living reminder of a dynasty that had defied nature for too long. And still, the throne remained childless, and the empire grew weaker. Spain had once believed marriage was its greatest weapon. But for Carlos too, marriage had become nothing more than a cruel stage play, two queens bound to him, neither able to give the nation what it needed most. The boy king who had once been hailed as a miracle now stood revealed as the embodiment of his dynasty's ruin. By the time Carlos II reached his 30s, his body had become a cruel parody of kingship. Though he was only 33, he looked like a man twice his age. His once dark hair had thinned to wisps, leaving patches of bald scalp. His legs trembled so violently that he could scarcely stand without help. His skin sagged, pale and blotched, and his oversized Habsburg jaw jutted forward grotesquely, stretching his face into a mask of perpetual suffering. His tongue was so large it barely fit within his mouth, making his speech slurred and his eating labored. Every meal became a trial, every step a battle. Foreign envoys described him in letters that dripped with pity and disdain. "The king is a shadow," wrote one ambassador. "His body is wasted, his mind confused. He cannot walk unaided, and his eyes stare vacantly, as if the soul within has already fled." For Spain's enemies, these reports were cause for quiet celebration. For his subjects, they were a confirmation of what they already feared: their king was a prisoner of his own body, incapable of saving them. And yet, he lived. Year after year, despite predictions of imminent death, Carlos clung to life. His survival seemed almost unnatural, a cruel prolonging of both his personal misery and Spain's decline. Superstition filled the void where science could not explain. Courtiers, priests, even physicians insisted the king was bewitched. How else could one explain a monarch who lived so long yet could not sire a single child? Carlos himself came to believe it. In whispered confession to his Dominican friar, Froilan Diaz, he admitted, "A curse prevents me from fathering children. I am under a spell." His words fueled hysteria. Exorcists were summoned. Sorcerers were hunted. Suspected witches were dragged to prisons, tortured into confessions, burned at the stake in plazas across Spain. Within the palace, rituals took on a grotesque character. Priests chanted over Carlos's body, sprinkling him with holy water, pressing relics to his chest. Physicians prescribed bizarre remedies, concoctions of herbs mixed with bull's testicles, potions of ground pearls, baths in animal blood. At one point, officials even ordered graves dug up, searching corpses for signs of dark magic supposedly placed upon the king. But none of it changed the truth. The curse was not witchcraft but blood. Generations of intermarriage had twisted the Habsburg lineage into a genetic trap. Out of 32 great-great-grandparents in Carlos's family tree, 14 were the same individuals, repeated through different branches. His inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born from a father and daughter. Nature had been defied for too long, and now it was taking its revenge. The results were written in Carlos's body. His immune system was so weak that even a simple cold could bring him near death. He suffered frequent seizures, collapsing in fits that left him trembling and exhausted. His organs, doctors later reported, were malformed, his testicles shriveled, his heart so small that it was compared to a peppercorn. His entire being seemed built for failure. As his body withered, so too did Spain. The empire that once ruled the seas now staggered under the weight of endless wars and empty treasuries. Rebellions festered in the provinces, soldiers deserted unpaid, and merchants groaned under heavy taxes. Once mighty Spain had become a second-rate power, its decline embodied in the figure of its king. Beyond Spain's borders, Europe sharpened its knives. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, pressed the claim of his grandson, Philip of Anjou. The Austrian Habsburgs, desperate to keep Spain within their sphere, rallied around Archduke Charles. Both had blood ties to the Spanish throne, and both eyed the vast inheritance of Spain's empire, its lands in Italy, its strongholds in the Low Countries, its colonies across the oceans. The question was not whether Spain would fall, it was who would catch it. Inside the Alcazar, Carlos felt the vultures circling. He knew his time was short, and yet he could not escape the crushing helplessness of his existence. He was haunted by nightmares, convinced demons plagued him, convinced that witchcraft bound him in chains. Priests filled his chambers with incense and chants, their shadows dancing against candlelit walls as they tried to cast out the unseen forces. But the true demon was the dynasty itself, the arrogance of a family that believed bloodlines mattered more than nature. The courtiers whispered behind closed doors. They pitied the king, yes, but they also despised him. He was a man-child, incapable of leading, incapable of providing heirs, incapable of saving his empire. They bowed before him in ceremony, but in private, they planned for the future, one in which Carlos was gone and Spain became the prize of Europe's great powers. By the late 1690s, it was clear to all that his death was near. His body wasted away, his seizures grew more violent, his face sunken and grey. He could hardly walk, and when he did, he leaned heavily on attendants, his crown slipping on his thinning hair. And yet, even as death loomed, Carlos remained the center of Europe's most dangerous game. For in his frail hands lay the fate of an empire, and with his death would come the firestorm of war. The year was 1700, and Europe watched Madrid like vultures circling a dying beast. For months, the ambassadors' letters home all carried the same refrain: the king is failing quickly. Spain will soon be without a monarch, and without an heir. Inside the Alcazar palace, King Carlos II lay wasted on his bed, more spectre than sovereign. He was only 39 years old, but his body was that of an old man. His skin clung tightly to bone, his once dark hair had thinned to wisps of grey, his legs trembled uncontrollably. The Habsburg jaw, now monstrously pronounced, distorted his face into a grotesque mask of suffering. Every breath rattled. Every seizure drained him further. Courtiers whispered in the corridors, waiting for the inevitable. And all of Europe waited with them. For Carlos's death would not just mark the end of a life. It would mark the end of a dynasty. For 2 centuries the Habsburgs had ruled Spain, their empire stretching across continents. But their pride, the belief that their blood was too precious to mix, had sown the seeds of their destruction. Now, the fate of Spain, of Europe itself, balanced on the final breaths of a broken king. Despite his failing strength, Carlos summoned one last act of will. With trembling hands, he signed his testament: the Spanish throne would pass not to his Austrian cousins, but to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France. "May God forgive me," Carlos whispered, "for I have been a poor king for Spain." It was a decision made in desperation, but also in clarity. Carlos knew Spain needed a strong ruler, and France, despite being a rival, had the power to provide it. Perhaps, he thought, by choosing Philip, he could save his kingdom from being carved apart. But his choice was a spark thrown onto dry tinder. On November 1, 1700, Carlos II died. He left behind no children, no legacy of strength, only a broken body and a kingdom on the brink. His autopsy revealed horrors that seemed almost biblical in their severity: organs misplaced, digestive systems ravaged, testicles blackened and shriveled, a heart so small it was compared to a peppercorn. Whether exaggerated by rumor or not, the reports confirmed what everyone already believed: Carlos was the living proof of a dynasty that had consumed itself. The funeral was somber. Courtiers filed past the coffin, their faces pale, their thoughts unspoken. They had served a king who had never truly ruled, a monarch who had been more a symbol of decay than of strength. One secretary recorded bitterly, "So ends the House of Austria in Spain, with a king who could not give us heirs, leaving our throne to our enemies." But death did not bring peace. It brought war. France embraced Carlos's testament immediately. Philip of Anjou was proclaimed Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king. In Versailles, Louis XIV declared proudly, "The Pyrenees no longer exist." To him, France and Spain were now bound by blood and crown. Austria, however, refused to accept it. The Habsburgs in Vienna would not surrender Spain's empire to their French rivals. Soon, England and the Dutch Republic joined them, fearful of France's growing power. Together they formed the Grand Alliance, determined to block Bourbon supremacy. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, a conflict that would consume Europe for 13 years. Battles raged from the Low Countries to Italy, from the Pyrenees to the high seas. Armies marched, cities burned, tens of thousands died, all because a broken king had left no heir. By the war's end, Spain was forever changed. It lost its possessions in Italy and the Low Countries. Gibraltar fell into English hands, never to return. Spain itself, once the dominant power of Europe, was reduced to a second-tier kingdom. And yet, the dynasty did not vanish entirely. The Bourbons, Philip V and his descendants, would rule Spain for centuries to come. Their blood was still royal, but it was not the cursed blood of the Habsburgs. The new line avoided the extreme inbreeding of the past. Over time, Spain regained a measure of stability, though never the vast supremacy it had once wielded. For historians, the story of Carlos II is more than a tale of a single man. It is a warning etched in flesh and blood. His portraits still hang in Madrid's Prado Museum. To walk past them is to watch decline unfold in real time, generation after generation. The faces grow longer, the jaws heavier, the lips droop lower, until finally they culminate in Carlos, the bewitched king. Looking at those portraits is like witnessing the laws of nature reclaim their due. Power had blinded the Habsburgs. Pride had convinced them that bloodlines mattered more than health, that crowns could defy biology. But nature cannot be bribed, cajoled, or commanded. In the end, even kings must bow to its laws. Carlos II's body was a testament to that truth. A frail vessel carrying the weight of an empire, he became both victim and symbol of his dynasty's arrogance. His death ended an era, and his tragedy reshaped Europe. The last Habsburg king of Spain left behind no heirs, no victories, no redemption, only a lesson whispered through history: even the mightiest houses can fall, when they mistake power for immortality. When Carlos II of Spain breathed his last on the first day of November, 1700, Europe exhaled with him. The death of a man so frail, so pitiful, might have ended quietly under other circumstances. But Carlos was not just any man, he was the last Habsburg king of Spain, and his death was the opening shot of a new and devastating chapter in European history. News of his passing spread quickly, carried by riders and ships across the continent. In Paris, Louis XIV smiled with satisfaction. His grandson, Philip of Anjou, was now Philip V of Spain. France and Spain, once bitter rivals, were suddenly bound by blood and crown. To Louis, it seemed the culmination of destiny. He famously declared, "The Pyrenees no longer exist." But in Vienna, the mood was outrage. The Austrian Habsburgs refused to accept the will. How could centuries of Spanish rule be handed to their French enemy? In London and The Hague, leaders trembled at the thought of Bourbon dominance stretching from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. For them, it was not just a dynastic dispute but a matter of survival. Thus, from the deathbed of a broken king, the War of the Spanish Succession was born. For 13 long years, Europe burned. From the fields of Flanders to the plains of Italy, from the Pyrenees to the open seas, armies clashed in brutal battles. Great generals like the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy rose to fame, their victories etched into history. Cities were besieged, economies drained, and entire generations scarred. Spain itself was caught in the middle, its soil soaked with the blood of foreign soldiers. Its people, weary from decades of decline, suffered famine, disease, and conscription. The once proud empire became a battlefield where others decided its fate. When the war finally ended with the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt in 1713 to 1714, Spain was transformed forever. The Bourbon dynasty survived, Philip V remained king, but the cost was immense. Spain surrendered its territories in Italy and the Low Countries. Gibraltar fell into English hands, a loss that still echoes today. The Spanish Empire shrank, its aura of invincibility shattered. The age of Spain as Europe's dominant power was over. And yet, the shadow of Carlos II lingered. His reign, more absence than action, had become a cautionary tale. Historians traced his tragedy not to witchcraft or divine punishment, but to the relentless pursuit of dynastic purity. The Habsburgs had believed that marrying within their own line would preserve their power. Instead, it destroyed them. Carlos's body itself had been a map of that arrogance. His grotesque jaw, his swollen tongue, his shriveled organs, all were physical reminders that nature could not be bent to political ambition. Out of 32 great-great-grandparents, 14 were the same individuals repeated again and again. His very blood carried the weight of his family's mistakes. Visitors to Madrid's Prado Museum can see this truth unfold in brushstrokes. The portraits of Habsburg rulers, painted by masters like Velázquez and Carreño de Miranda, line the walls like a slow-motion tragedy. Generation after generation, the features become sharper, stranger, more exaggerated, until finally they culminate in Carlos, pale, deformed, and exhausted before his life even began. To stand before those paintings is to witness decline in real time. They are not just portraits, they are warnings. For Spain, the Bourbon dynasty learned some lessons. Marriages remained political, but the extremes of Habsburg inbreeding were avoided. Over time, their bloodline diversified. Spain slowly regained stability, though it would never return to the global supremacy it once held. The golden age of conquest and empire was gone, replaced by a more modest, more fragile kingdom. Elsewhere in Europe, however, the lesson was only half learned. Other dynasties continued to intermarry, though rarely with such intensity. Later centuries saw hemophilia spread through the descendants of Queen Victoria of England, crippling royal houses in Russia, Germany, and beyond. Once again, nature reminded kings and queens that crowns offered no protection from the laws of biology. And so, the story of Carlos II transcends its time and place. It is not merely a Spanish tragedy, but a human one. It speaks of the danger of pride, of power pursued without restraint, of ambition that ignored the simplest truths of life. Carlos himself believed he was bewitched, cursed by spells and demons. In truth, he was cursed by his own ancestors, by their arrogance, by their belief that they were above the very laws that governed all mortals. His life was not his own, but the inevitable conclusion of choices made generations before him. On his deathbed, he confessed, "I have been a poor king for Spain." Perhaps he was right. But perhaps, in his frailty, he left a lesson more enduring than any conquest. His broken body became the final punctuation mark on the age of Habsburg Spain, a reminder that no power is eternal, and no bloodline is immortal. When we look back today, across the centuries, the echo of his story is unmistakable. Even the mightiest empires can collapse from within. Even the grandest names can end in silence. And even kings must bow to the same laws of nature as the humblest peasant. Carlos II, the bewitched king, was not the savior his father prayed for. He was the reckoning his dynasty had long avoided. His death ended an era. His tragedy reshaped Europe. And his shadow still lingers, a warning whispered through history: when pride defies nature, the fall is inevitable.